The time has come for the Cobra to rise up and reveal himself.
Welcome back, my quiver of capitalists, to AP Economics, presented by Cobranomics, your all-American history teacher, gold standard of economics, le champion of classical liberalism, and sensei of supply side, Professor G here, and today we are going to take a look at the Keynesian criticisms of monetary policy. And it first starts with this equation called the equation of exchange, which is also what is called a tautology, meaning that even though different sides disagree, people believe that this equation is true. The question, and the Keynesian criticism of this, is to what extent this is true in both the short run and the long run. So we're going to take a look at the equation of exchange, take a look at what it implies, and then take a look at Keynes's criticism of the equation of exchange. So let's break it down. M times V equals P times Q. This means the money supply times the velocity of money, which is the trickiest one. The velocity of money means the amount of times a typical dollar is spent per year, or essentially how many times a typical dollar goes around the circular flow model. So how many revolutions that dollar has around the circular flow model, how many times it's spent per year. Price is the prices in the economy, and Q equals output. So what this essentially means is the amount of money times the amount that money goes around the circular flow model equals price times quantity, or putting price times quantity together equals price times quantity, which is essentially nominal GDP. So the amount of money in the economy times the amount of times that money is spent through a typical year will equal the nominal GDP, which kind of makes sense. The amount of times money goes around the circular flow model that it's spent, earned, should equal the nominal GDP. So this is why all economists believe that this equation is true. The question, though, is what is the relationship between velocity and output? And here's where Keynes comes in and says that monetary policy is effective in the short run, but not in the long run. And this is where Keynes' famous quote is actually applied to, that in the long run, we are all dead. That you should not increase the amount of money in the economy because all you're going to have left is inflationary pressures after the short run. So Keynes believes that ultimately, velocity and output in the short run, they are stable, they are similar but not exact, but in the long run, they are constant. So for the Keynesian criticism, we have, for velocity and output, in the short run, it is stable, and in the long run, it is constant. So what does that mean? That means in the short run, an increase in the money supply. Well, now you have increased the amount of money. That money goes around and around the circular flow model. So therefore, that money will generate an increase in GDP. However, in the short run, you will have an increase in aggregate demand. As we saw with the Federal Reserve, increases the money supply. That amount of money decreases the nominal interest rates, which increases spending, which increases nominal GDP. However, Keynes says, well, if velocity is tied to output, in the long run, all you've really done to the economy is just increase the amount of money in the economy. And if you've just increased the amount of money in the economy, if these two are constant, so velocity and output are not changing, that means that in the long run, an increase in the money supply, as velocity is not changing, so the only thing the Federal Reserve can really do here is change money supply. An increase in the long run will only increase prices. So in the long run, it is ineffective. In the long run, you only have a change in prices. So in the long run, only prices change, and output, and therefore unemployment will return to where it was. And this is called the neutrality of money. That in the short run, monetary policy is effective. It does all of the things the previous lessons have stated. That changes the money supply, which trickles through the banking system, increasing investment spending, and increasing aggregate demand. However, in the long run, since output is tied to velocity, in the long run, all the Federal Reserve has really done is increase the amount of money in the economy, and therefore the prices, and now we have a new economic problem. And so in the long run, only prices change, and the new inflationary pressures will return output to where it was. So in the long run, neutrality of money, meaning the effect of monetary policy in the long run is a neutral effect. There's no actual change to the economy in the long run. And this usually appears as a one-off or one or two multiple choice questions. So just be careful if you see neutrality of money in the long run. Because of Keynes's interpretation of the equation of exchange, monetary policy is only effective in the short run, not the long run. Now we're going to take a look at Keynes's second criticism of monetary policy, which is his interpretation of the money market graph and why he believes that changing the money supply is not as effective as monetarists say. The next criticism of Keynes on monetary policy is Keynes's view of the impact of interest rates on the public and on the banking system and people's ability and willingness to borrow. Okay, unlike, for the monetarist point of view, monetarists believe that because of the slope of the money demand curve and a bit of behavioral science, ask mathematical behavioral science, that an increase in the money supply curve has a noticeable effect on the change in interest rates. So we see here a change, an increase in the money supply has a noticeable change in the decrease in the nominal interest rate, and therefore this will have a noticeable change in aggregate demand. So for monetarists, the nominal interest rate changes to the nominal interest rate, and therefore the real interest rate throughout the banking system is quite noticeable. The monetarists believe that nominal interest rate has a noticeable effect on people's ability and willingness to borrow, and because of their belief, their money demand curve is shaped with this sloping incline, that a change to the money supply will have a noticeable change in the nominal interest rate, reflecting their belief that people do and businesses do react noticeably and substantially to a change in interest rates. And even though Keynes does criticize this, which we're going to take a look at in a second, this is still the version to draw on the AP test because it is based on, it is the best one on the banking system and just the most reflective of it. Even though Keynes is, the father of our course, is always normally the right answer on the AP test, this is the main one you should draw on the AP test. But let's take a look at the Keynesian criticism, though, which is important. And for Keynes, Keynes believes that people do not react as substantially to changes in the nominal interest rate. And therefore, Keynes's money demand curve is sloped differently. It's actually kind of more curved, reflecting that at a certain point, the money demanded, regardless of the interest rate, based on the interest rate, just kind of plateaus, that it's not as effective. People will not react. If it's 2% versus 3%, that doesn't dramatically, even though in terms of paying money back, it's a sizable number, people will still go through with their purchases. If it goes from 2 to 3, or 3 to 2, or maybe even from 2 to 4, that these are not, people will still generally go through with their borrowing. So for Keynes, and this is really just a debate between, a mathematical and graphical debate between human nature and how people respond to interest rates. But for Keynes says that people do not substantially respond to changes in the interest rates. And he reflects his view of people's behavior with a more curved money demand curve that plateaus at each end. So for Keynes, when the Federal Reserve changes the money supply, we see a much smaller change to the nominal interest rate. That ultimately changes to the money supply curve are not that effective, as we saw earlier with the equation of exchange, that it's not as effective as regular government spending, and it does not substantially change the interest rate enough. Not only does it not change the interest rate enough, but as we see here, so it changes the money supply curve because of how people react to changes in the nominal interest rate. The money changes to the money supply curve does not substantially change the nominal interest rate as it did over here. Here we notice a larger change, a steeper change to the nominal interest rate than here. So the Keynesian criticism is the money supply curve does not substantially change the interest rate. People don't substantially react to swings in the nominal interest rate, and therefore money supply, if the change to interest rate is smaller, well then therefore the effective aggregate demand will be smaller as well. So for monetarists, changes to the nominal interest rate fully affect the aggregate demand curve, and for Keynes, changes to the money supply do not substantially change the nominal interest rate and therefore don't fully affect the aggregate demand curve to the point where we return to equilibrium. And then also for Keynes, going back to the equation of exchange, in the short term, yes, this will change the aggregate demand curve a little, but in the long term, all the Federal Reserve has really done is just put all this extra money into the economy, and then after a short-term change in nominal GDP, the economy will return to normal, output will return to where it was, and all the economy will have to show for it is more money, which means higher prices. For the AP test, Keynes's criticisms appear more as multiple choice, kind of one-off questions, whereas if you have to draw the money market graph and explain the effectiveness, you should definitely draw this one, and you should also use the previous lessons explaining why it is effective, because the free response questions will ask you to explain why Federal Reserve changes to the money supply curve will positively affect the economy, or inversely, if they're trying to shrink the money supply curve, will contract the economy. So be aware, of kind of a double-edged sword lesson here, be aware of Keynes's criticism. If they appear, and the test will very overtly talk about Keynes's criticism of it. However, if it's just asking you straight up what happens when the Federal Reserve does this, draw this graph and explain the full effects that we've gone over in previous lessons. Thank you for watching. Remember, whether it is your money, your mind, or your body, invest hard, invest often, and no feelings. Money never sleeps.